myself, but seek multiple sources of information and compare. Unfortunately, in this environment, the government, going to the government and relying on the government is kind of the lazy person's path forward. We're now in a situation where we have to take ownership. If you want to be a sovereign individual, if you care to be a free living, independent thinker, you now are forced to be rigorous in sourcing multiple sources of information and look for those little gaps, look for that electric fence, and be very aware of this strategy called the limited hangout, which is deployed all the time, or notoriously in the Nixon years, the modified limited hangout. That language of limited hangout is an intelligence community term. And what it refers to is that when it becomes overwhelmingly obvious that something is true that they don't want you to believe, what they'll do is push out information, like Politico is a favorite vehicle for that. They'll push out information in which they concede the obvious, and then obscure that which remains, which they wish to deflect you from. So this is a limited hangout. And there's a notorious recent Politico piece in which I pointed this out to Steve Bannon. Steve and Naomi had gotten really excited about that piece, in which there was admission of issues relating to the engineering of the virus and the role of the Wuhan lab. But what they missed was that this was part of a campaign that had been deployed seeking major additional capital for the World Health Organization and expanded authority in the form of the International Health Regulations. So, in sum, how do you do it? It's tough. And what I always say, again and again and again, don't just listen to me. Don't believe that I know the truth. Don't accept what I'm saying as gospel truth. Think for yourself. What I've tried to do over these last years, mile after mile, podcast after podcast, is help teach people what they need to know in order to do their own thinking and encourage them to think for themselves. If they care to be in that 10% of people that really want to be free and maintain their sovereignty. Unfortunately, most people just want to be told what to do. They just want to follow. And probably most of those people don't know.
Dr. Robert Malone, check out his brand new book, Lies My Government Told Me and the Better Future Coming. Dr. Malone, thanks for speaking out and thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate the information and the insight.
Thanks, Ben.
Joining us online is Harmeet Dillon, nationally recognized lawyer, founder of the Center for American Liberty, which committed to defending the civil rights of all Americans. Full disclosure, Harmeet Dillon also happens to be one of the lawyers who's working with us in our attempt to fight back the OSHA vax mandate from the Biden administration. Harmeet, thanks so much for joining the show.
Can it be so dark?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben.
Because there's no light, silly.
So, Harmeet, you've decided now to throw your hat in the ring for head of the RNC against Romney McDaniel. I've said from very early after the election, you don't lose 3 consecutive election cycles and keep your job. I mean, this is a very simple problem. You lose in 2018, you lose in 2020, actually you lose in 2021 again, 4 consecutive elections. At that point, you have to start looking at other alternatives. You've decided that you want to provide that other alternative. Number one, is it realistic to think, a lot of questions raised, is it realistic to think that you could actually oust Ronna McDaniel, given her support inside the RNC, and put that
Thanks, Ben. And absolutely, if possible. We still have more than 4 weeks to the election, in Dana Point, California. And during that time, and the leadership race in the RNC, there were several rounds of restraining, trying to get support. So the process is as follows. We have 168 voting members, states, 6 territories, and they vote and there will be successive rounds of voting. Since I announced less than 3 weeks ago, I've already received a tremendous outpouring of support, not just from the voters in America, but Republican donors, United States Senators, Congress, senators, but members of the RNC. Some of them were on and many who joined my campaign because of concerns concerns about the current leader's tenure. So this is very much doable. It's a horse race, and we're working to convert and talk to each member, see what their concerns are, and see if I can address those concerns.
So, I mean, looking at how Ronna McDaniel has run the RNC, what are some of the critiques of the RNC for me just from the outside and saying they're doing a bad job, results but what are some of the specific things that the RNC should have been doing better over the past several years given the opportunity?
Well, let's start by saying, to be very fair, Ronna is one of many players in the RNC has a specific role. She's the leader of the organization. And I think in the last 6 years, of course, there are candidates who may or may not have made right choices, but overall, the party is supposed to provide the air cover and lay the groundwork for candidates to have the best chance of winning. Now, for almost 20 years now, Democrats very highly organized and highly focused on winning.
Many creatures avoid places where the veil is thin. I suspect this was
in a very organized fashion, make sure that their candidates have the best chances, and then outside groups pouring money. But we don't have that. We really have made the RNC over the last couple years has really failed to be a leader in election integrity efforts, in my opinion. As you know, the many things that we do at my law firm and my work is something that I think is very important. Mark Elias, for example, is very well funded by the left and has had free rein to file any number of lawsuits to challenge election laws throughout the United States without any answer for the most part. So I've been on the RNC for 6 years, about the same amount of time as Ronna. And during that time, I've been agitating for this to happen. We haven't been doing it at either the pace or the volume that needed to be done. Now, we are playing catch-up now, but our RNC building dismantled the integrity team election as if they are seasonal workers who pick the crop and then they go home. It is a year-round effort on the left, but it has to be a year-round effort, investment, and really vision of the chair to make that happen, talk to donors who care about it, and really raise the funds so that that continues, whoever is the chair. The RNC is a very top-down organization. In fact, I just got an email from a member who's supporting Ronna, being very critical of my desire to involve grassroots. One member told Politico, one of the members on the other side of this dispute, that it was that leadership was selected in a papal enclave, smoke-filled backroom type place. I mean, that's not the image that our grassroots voters have brought into the party over the last many years think about when they think about the RNC. They think about a body that's supposed to represent them, and that image is not there. And I'll add one more point, which is I think our messaging has not been very good over the last few years. We have not inspired our voters to turn out and support our candidates. Our messaging has been reactive. You can understand over the last couple of years.
Take pagan wisdom and to preserve it and to cherish it, to nurture it, that this sort of licenses and justifies.
I just want to say one more thing. It's important because we might think that this is just an allegorical flurry, that this is just some kind of thing you put into the text, but we have to notice that very soon that gold that the Egyptians have given the Israelites will be used to first make the golden calf, and then later used to make the ornaments of the tabernacle. And so you can see exactly the potential that is taken from Egypt is now shown to be either corrupting, if it's in the wrong order, to make the idols of the pagan idols, or then ultimately in service of God in order to make the ornaments of the tabernacle. So exactly towards McGilchrist. I don't know if McGilchrist is aware of him, but so he says that Aaron is the helper, and he presents him as the guardian angel. He says Aaron is like the guardian angel, and each person, like in the cartoons, they have an angel on their right shoulder and a devil on their left shoulder, and both of those are something like their Aaron, the two possibilities of Aaron. So it's like an influence which can pull you in one direction or the other, and you have to be able to see the good helper and be careful of the bad helper.
You know, if you're orienting yourself properly in the world, I would say in relationship to your own intelligence and your own verbal acuity, you want to keep that Luciferian intellect subordinate to the ability to see the burning bush when it manifests itself. And that's why attention should be subordinate to verbal acuity. Because you want to be open to the revelation of the divine, because that's what keeps your Luciferian intellect in check. And I would say that's partly why it's reasonable for someone like Dostoevsky and then Solzhenitsyn to say, beauty will save the world. Because you have a revelation of the divine in the apprehension of beauty. And that's not, that has to be translated into the verbal before it's...
Yeah, so attention, definition.
Attention
first, definition second.
Well, and I would say the heavenly hierarchy, most fundamentally, is the hierarchy of attention. That is what it is.
Is there also not, I mean, what do you make of the fact, I mean, Moses is hardly portrayed here as, you know, the hero. God says go, he says, oh, well, who should I tell them sent me? And then he says, okay, well, listen. He says, well, they won't believe me. He says, okay, well, here's 2 miracles. Oh, but I'm not very eloquent. So, I mean,
well,
here's what they're all saying.
Like problem.
Well, is it, like, Moses...
struck me deeply. Here you have this totality of Egypt, and only a higher, stronger, greater totality can answer it. You said something like that. Now, that will be the future of humanity as we get more totalitarian.
Well, it's so interesting
and this is
here.
why monotheism, properly understood, will be the only thing able to stand against the world of Xi Jinping and so on.
Well, it's so interesting, too, that the monotheism here in this particular story, which is part of why we're concentrating on this story, it's a monotheism in the service of those who wrestle with God being necessarily free on ethical grounds from tyranny. And so the monotheism is in service of that freedom from tyranny, properly understood, and that's partly what makes it not a tyrannical monotheism in and of itself.
I wouldn't say monotheism in the service. Then you get to the celestial butler almost. I'm kidding you.
Okay.
But,
all right. So then more than...
In other words...
It reveals itself in that.
Under
Is a better way to say it.
Yes, that's right.
It's an outrage for a human made in his image to dominate any other human made in his image. And so freedom is an essential of that vision of God.
Right, well, that's quite the vision of a unifying totality. It's not a tyrant.
Absolutely.
It's the thing that
but not monotheism in the service of anything.
Right. I'm kidding you. No, I spoke improperly. In thinkers was that and that there may be blood. Behold, I will smite with the rod by the river's brink against he come, and the rod which was turned to a serpent, Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto
always rather than prophet.
Prophet would be more
confusion. Yeah, prophet in Greek I think means to literally to speak out, to proclaim. Yeah, and so maybe that was how the confusion
that's interesting.
Yeah, prophet. So it doesn't just mean a predictor, but one who declares, speaks out,
it
speaks
became predictor, but it wasn't originally. That's good. I'm glad to know that.
Yeah.
And he hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuseth to let the people go. Get thee unto Pharaoh in the morning. Lo, he goeth out unto the water. So that's Moses' domain again, the water. And thou shalt stand by the river's brink against he come. And the rod which was turned to a serpent shalt thou take in thine hand. And thou shalt say unto him, the Lord God of the Hebrews hath sent me unto thee, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. So we get that parallelism we talked about yesterday. It's not just let my people go, it's not even freedom. And not in this abstract sense. They're going, because the Israelites are the people that wrestle with God. That's what the word means. And let my people go, they mean serve me in the wilderness, to find their proper place in the which is not under your tyranny. And behold, now is not here. Thus saith the Lord. In this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the rod that is in my hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians will want to drink of the water of the river. And the Lord spake unto Moses, say unto Aaron, take thy rod, and stretch out thine hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon the streams, upon the rivers, and upon the ponds, all the pools of water, that they may become blood, that there may be blood, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. And Moses and did so as the Lord commanded, and he lifted up the rod, and smote the waters that were in the river, in the sight of Pharaoh, and in the sight of his servants. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. I have one of the things I learned from reading the Union thinkers was that, and Mircea Eliade is particularly powerful on this, was that you can't really distinguish the revenge of nations from the tyranny of the king. Because what happens when your state becomes corrupt and overbearing is that your ability to regulate nature degenerates in a manner that's commensurate, and so nature rebels. So here's an example. With the hurricane and the winds, you could say, well, that's a natural disaster. It's an act of God. But then you could say, well, wait a second. The Dutch built their dikes to withstand one storm, the worst storm in 10,000 years. So when the storm hits the Netherlands, there's no natural disaster. Whereas the Army Corps of Engineers built the dikes to withstand one storm in a century. And so once in 100 years, there's a natural disaster. And then, because the state that surrounds New Orleans is corrupt in many ways, not only is the infrastructure not built properly, but it's degenerated because of corruption. And so the rebellion of nature and the corrupt tyranny of the state are in some sense inseparable. And so it seems to me that that's part of the reason why here it's the very water that rebels. If the state becomes tyrannical and corrupt enough, then everything is allowed to become polluted in some great sense.
Kitchen won't give me cakes because Josie owes those
The
bricks
river and
for
the
sending
Nile
them
is
to
as close as you can
allies.
get to Egypt,
why
it's the
cakes when you
symbol
can
of
give them a
Egypt. It's
two-fingered salute
the
and a box
water of
full of
Egypt's
dog
life
shit?
being turned
That's
to the
the other
water
thing, sure.
of death.
Right. It's like the water of life.
You know
and
I
so,
hate the
and now it's
aristocracy as
become
much as you
corrupted.
do.
Well, it's
I
turned
hate
to
that they
blood to
sit in
remind them
palaces
of the
sipping wine while
Hebrew
people
babies that
starve
were
outside
drowned
their
there.
gates.
It's
Right.
a
I hate that
Symbolic
good
bloody
soldiers
river.
die in
And
senseless
isn't
wars over who
each
gets
of the
the fancy
plagues
chair.
is specifically
Still,
targeting one of
it's
the
better to have
Egyptian
the
gods?
nobility on your
Right?
side than
The Nile is
their dogs
the river
all
god.
of them. And even the primped and powdered
Sure
ones
of
have
death.
teeth.
Right.
That's some dog shit. Oh, that's a good one.
That rebels is that if the state becomes tyrannical and corrupt enough, then everything is allowed to become polluted in some real sense. So,
Well, I suppose the river and the Nile is as close as you can get to Egypt, or it's the symbol of Egypt. It's the water of Egypt's life being
right. Well,
turned to
that's
the
the other
waters
thing, sure.
of death.
Right. It's like the water of life,
Right.
and now it's
Yeah.
become corrupted.
Yeah.
Well, it's turned to blood to remind them of the Hebrew babies that were drowned there.
Right.
It's
Right.
a
So
bloody,
it's
it's a
symbolically
bloody river.
appropriate. Yeah.
And isn't each of the plagues is specifically targeting one of the Egyptian gods? Is
Yes,
that right?
except
So the
that
Nile
there's-
is the river god. There's a river god of the Nile. Yeah. Yeah.
And frogs.
How did you find that out? I didn't know that at all.
I just remember this vaguely from, like, freshman year of Jesuit high school.
Jesuit high school. Those Jesuits. Well, one of the
They know
things
what they're
that
doing, the Jesuits.
One of the important aspects as well that we might miss is the use of the rod. That is, the use of the rod as a symbol of authority. This is a universal thing. Even the Pharaoh has a scepter, the rod, all of this as a manifestation of authority, and you see it in the story as well.
It's the primordial tool, right? A stick. It's the primordial tool.
And it does represent that vertical power, like the manner in which authority descends into the world is through this kind of vertical descent. So the rod represents that. You can imagine, striking the waters, and you'll see Moses use it. Yeah, it is. It is in many ways a magic wand. There are even early images of Christ where they show Christ's miracle where he's holding a staff. And he does his miracles with a staff because it's so ingrained in people's understanding.
Well, why do you need a wand if you're a wizard? Just point out your hand and do your tricks. But no, you have to have a magic wand. And
So, and that's a derivative.
It's
of
an
the staff
externalization
idea.
of your authority, and that's what the miracle is also, is an externalization of authority. And so the wand becomes a proxy for, it's like I'm going to act, and then the wand already is an externalization.
Well, you know, if you use a stick, human nervous systems are extremely extendable, and so in some sense, like when you're in an automobile or in an airplane, if you're flying it, then your body, your brain remaps the whole tool to be part of your body. And so we're tool using in the deepest possible sense, and it is definitely the case that the stick is the primordial tool. It's the first spear, it's the first club. It's certainly a thing that you can smack snakes with, and I'm sure, you know, our tree-dwelling relatives cottoned onto that at some point in the extremely distant past. And so the notion that the rod is magic is the same as the notion that the tool is magic, and it's definitely magic. There's in any...
Don't you move on to the Roman, what's it called, fasces? The rod's authority, and then you get fascism.
Right.
Authoritarianism.
And those are when the rod can't turn into a snake anymore, or maybe turns into too many snakes.
It's always interesting to me how the icon carver's brain works, because you know, you need something. If God's moving through a person, it's like, well, how do you portray that? If you're making the action figure, what does he look like, right? And there's this amazing conversation, not to get us too far derailed, between Lucas, Kasdan, and Spielberg when they were developing Indiana Jones, and the conversation you can find, and they're like, well, he needs a different kind of had. Like, how about a whip, right? A personality should have a life of its own. And so part of when we're trying to substantiate, when we're trying to make literal the symbolism, it can't just be that God, like if a wizard just points at somebody, well, what's a wizard look like? We need props. Right, and so this is of course something that you are dealing with in your depictions, or else everyone just look like a cat, right? Everyone look the same.
Yeah, but I think modern fiction has actually been very good. Like something like fantasy. Making the costumes and the representation of the person as an extension of the character, so that you see it immediately. Like Gandalf is such a and he can thrust it into the right, that's how I imagine Moses. Not like this.
Jonathan carves too. He just shows up.
I just like.
One of the questions I've had to ask myself to read this is, what's happened in my own life? And this is a very powerful image here, because the river, as James just pointed out, is the kind of iconic thing about Egypt. The light is the source of life in the Nile. And just really what's going on here is that you might say, the wrong relation to what really is. It's totally life-giving into a source of death. It seems to me that happens in our lives. You know, when you're when you're badly out of tune and willing, you know, things start to collapse.
Well, you start to die from the water,
yes.
from the lack of the water of life. There's a famous British brother fairy tale that's called Water of Life, and it's about a king who's he doesn't have the water of life, and that's associated with notions of the search for the pool, or the pool in the middle of the forest that revivifies. And water is often used as it's the antithesis of stone, it's the antidote to stone, it's the antithesis of thirst in the desert where there's no water, obviously. And
so there's a sense of what you're saying, in which what Pharaoh's actually doing is he's already cutting himself off from the water in a profound sense, and this is the symbol.
Yeah, remember, Moses is a master of water, fundamentally, right? He's symbolized by water.
Yeah, later on he opens up the water supply from the pool. People drink
well, that's exactly what he's doing with Egypt, in some sense. He's releasing the water of life from the rock that contains it.
You mentioned about freedom, and in verse 16, so this link between freedom and service, or even obedience, because the next line, it's thus saith the Lord, this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. So, use the distinction that Isaiah delivered between negative and positive freedom. This is definitely positive freedom. I mean, this is not just freedom from the oppression of the enemy. This is also a life of freedom that is fulfilled, because it is the realization of a particular goal. Exactly.
And so true freedom is construed here as service to what is highest. It's not anarchic or chaotic.
And the negative is basically the Janis Joplin definition, right? Like freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. It's when you just don't have anything. As opposed to, and it's interesting you said freedom's never used. That word's never used.
That's remarkable.
Which is very interesting.
The same word for working as slaves is the word for serving the Lord and worship. It's the same word.
Right, so the question then,
And even the
what
skeptics have
distinguishes
said
them?
the Lord is a despot, and they've shifted from one despot to another. But there's the Anglican prayer book, your service is free.
Worship to the right kind of worship.
Well, yeah, it is unbelievably important, Douglas, to reiterate that, because you don't ever want to confuse freedom with chaos. It's the same thing. You know, if you play a chess game, you're free to do an almost infinite number of things on the chess game board, but you have to abide by the rules, and you have to attempt to win in the proper manner. And so, and if you, I used to play games with my students in my class, and I'd go up to someone when we talked about such things and say, okay, do you want to play a game? Someone on the student, they'd say yes. I'd say, okay, you move first. And then they had no idea what to do. It's like, well, so you can do anything you want. It's like, well, I'm lost. It's like, yeah.
The wrong student back.
Yeah, I wouldn't ask you. All right. And the magicians of
I consider the funniest person in the world.
All right. And the magicians of Egypt. Yes, I think that's where we're at. 22:722. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments.
Okay, why is that so funny?
Because there's no more water to turn into blood.
Well, they're doing the what? Moses did that. They're judging.
Yes, they're saying hey, we can ruin our water supply too. I have always found this to be hilarious. Doesn't Pharaoh know any morons?
Yes, I think that's where we're at. 22:722. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments.
Okay, why is...
Blackwall! Oh, shit!
so funny?
Because there's no more water to turn into blood?
Well, they're doing the what?
I have always found this to be hilarious. And doesn't Pharaoh go, what are you, morons?
Right.
He ruins the water and you can do it too? Thank you.
Don't they do the same later with the gnats or the flies? He says just to add to it. Yeah.
You think,
Well, they also say it's all the water in the land is already turned, so it's like, what are they, like they're seeking out new water?
They had some water apparently.
And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Neither did he hearken unto them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Neither did he set his heart to this also. And all the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river. And 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. Exodus 8. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. And the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, and shall go up and come into thine house, and into thy bedchamber, and upon thy bed, and into the house of thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thine ovens, and into thy kneading troughs. And the frogs shall come up both on thee, and upon thy people, and upon all thy servants. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying unto Aaron, Stretch forth thine hand with thy rod over the streams, over the rivers, and over the ponds, and cause frogs to come up upon the land of Egypt. And Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians
kids in Jewish life sing the following song. There were one morning when Pharaoh woke in his bed, there were frogs on his head and frogs in his bed, frogs on his nose and frogs on his toes, frogs here, frogs there, frogs were jumping everywhere.
Well, this is a kind of comical plague.
Exactly, certainly, but the point that I love about that is the only reason these kids know about Pharaoh is because of the frogs. The king, the demigod of Egypt, is known to Jewish children thousands of years later because of frogs.
Do you think there's a transition here? So we have water first, but then frogs live halfway on water and halfway on land, right? They're this mediating creature. And, you know, the tribe of native Canadians that I am associated with, they regard the frog as a weather vane of nature in some sense too, because frogs are extremely sensitive to environmental degradation, and so they're the amphibian equivalent of canaries in the coal mine.
So what you'll see now in the plagues is you're going to see something like this. You're going to see something like death coming from below and getting higher and higher. And so it starts with just the water, which is turned into blood, and now from the water come these frogs. And then later you'll see from the dust comes the lice, and then the livestock, and then it's going to continue. We'll talk about it when we get there. So what you're seeing is basically the undoing of creation. You can understand it that way. That is, creation is this union of heaven and earth, and now there's there's going to be an undoing, where at first you're going to see the revolution of the earth from above, and then you're going to see a kind of oppression and hostility in aerial phenomena.
Okay, so Oz's point that was very interesting is that this great land of monuments were undone by gnats. And also it's like, what's the animal most associated with the pharaoh? Right, it's a snake. Right, and snakes eat frogs. And so like there's something that's very amusing with this, you know, Mel Brooks said nothing can stand up to humor. That's why he made fun of Hitler. Right. Nothing stands up to humor. And it's a very funny image to have this pharaoh with his grand, like, cobra decor being undone with frogs that his nursery can mock. And there's also, there's the Egyptian god who's associated with frogs, which I think you should know of all people.
I have a little statue.
Right.
It's Kek. Yeah. That's right, Kek. Yeah.
And so it's
that all came up with the whole Peppy thing, too.
Yeah, so the Peppy thing is funny in this context, in the sense of the amphibian. The church father, St. Gregory of Nyssa, I'm going to keep bringing up, sorry, really talks about the amphibious nature of being informed, because it has to be undoing. So the undoing is that which has They kind of set the image of the frogs become like an image of this undoing, where identities are breaking down.
Right, because they're like a psychopomp in some sense. They inhabit both places, and the frogs are fine if there's not too many of them. But when the confused identity frogs are everywhere, then you have real trouble.
Yeah, you're not supposed to have frogs in your house. They're in the water and on the front. But you have frogs in your house, frogs in your bread. Yeah, that's right.
Too many frogs.
That's a lot of ambiguity. Too much ambiguity.
Important point to add. You're right about the anti-creation and the destruction, but only the Lord can restore. He does every time. And it's the same thing with tyrants can destroy, and they do, but they can't rebuild. And that's very clear.
I like this theme of negative creation as kind of unwelcome creation rather than decreation. And I think actually we're licensed to draw that interpretation. If you look at, was it verse 25? Just the last and 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. So it's as if and that doesn't come elsewhere in any of the other plagues. It's almost as if we're being invited to
understand it in relationship to the creation.
Well, and it is a very common theological motif that when order falls apart, what you do see is a reversion to the potential that existed at the beginning of time. Those are the same thing, right? When order deteriorates, then you get a return, an undoing and a return to pre-cosmogonic chaos. It's out of that new order can emerge.
You also have to be careful. Even during the flood, we tend to think of the flood just as the water, but that's not what's going on. There's the water and the heavens, and it's the separation of the two which undoes the world. So we think of the flood just as the water, but you think of the image of just water and just heaven and nothing alive in between. So I think this is what we're going to see as we notice the first plagues are like this, and then all of a sudden it moves up, and then everything goes crazy above.
So is the construction of the tabernacle as a place where heaven and earth meet?
And so the tabernacle is the proper resting place of God. And also, in some sense, that which shields God from the careless view of human beings, the too careless view of human beings.
And the tabernacle is an encapsulation of creation.
That's right. It's a microcosm of the world. And the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch forth thy hand with thy rod over the streams, over the rivers, and over the ponds, and cause storms to come up upon them. And Aaron did so, and the floods came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments, and brought up frogs on the land of Egypt. Here's some more frogs. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, he's had it because he's up to his neck. Entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me. I will let the people go, that they may do sacrifice unto the Lord. Moses said unto Pharaoh, glory over me. When shall I entreat thee again for thy servants for thy people to destroy the frogs from the lands, that they may remain in the river only? And he said, tomorrow. And he said, be it according to thy word, that thou may knowest that there are none like unto the Lord our God. And the frogs shall depart from thee, and from thy houses, and from thy servants. So as soon as the tyrant bows to the will of God, then the ambivalent monsters depart. And from thy people, they shall remain in the river only. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh. And Moses cried unto the Lord because of the frogs which were against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. And the frogs died out of the houses, out of the villages, out of the fields. And they gathered them together upon heaps. And the land stank.
So give it to the whole, make Finn's life shit. Or give it to Finn. We helped him. Not ask him, do it.
We've
been permitted to bend tradition.
That's
it may be best to tread carefully.
Think about how that works in your own life. It's like, you repent, you get away with it. I can do it again. And the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, so that it may become lice.
Grey Wardens have beards?
No, just me. I stole all the beards, and all the power held within. There can be only one.
Not really.
Throughout all the land of Egypt. And so then they're longing for the days of frogs. And they did so.
The third plague of each set of three, forgetting the 10th is totally separate.
Said, that's another place, Stephen, where you can think about how that works in your own life. It's like, you repent, you get away with it, you think, I got it, I can do it again. It's like, and the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, so that they become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And so then they're longing for the days of frogs. And they did so.
The third plague of each set of three, forgetting the 10th is totally separate, they don't warn Pharaoh. Just the pattern that it
well, the first one's in the morning. Hey,
that's also of each set of three, forgetting the 10th is totally separate, they don't warn Pharaoh. Just the pattern that it
well, the first one's in the morning. Hey,
that's also
the second one comes
that's right
from the palace. Third one.
There are a lot of patterns in the plagues.
Very carefully constructed.
I wonder why it's the third time there's no warning. Well, I guess you've been warned twice.
Right, you're warned twice.
That's fair, right? I warned you twice.
Right, exactly. And then we'll start it over again.
It's what's established to create a pattern that one can anticipate, right? You need, that's how jokes work, right? You need.
Oh, yeah, so you'd be like, okay, I warned you twice. It's your third strike. It's gonna be bad.
first two, and you anticipate the pattern, then you subvert it. So it's in some ways it's giving the Pharaoh fair chance.
Right.
With two.
Right. But it also adds an
you're warned twice.
That's
and
fair, right? I warned you twice.
Right, exactly. A lot of patterns in the plagues.
It's very carefully constructed.
I wonder why it's the third time there's no warning. Well, I guess you've been warned twice.
Right, you're warned twice.
That's
and then
fair, right? I warned you twice.
Right, exactly. And then we'll start it over again.
It's what's established to create a pattern that one can anticipate, right? You need, that's how jokes work, right? You need the first two, and you anticipate the pattern, then you subvert it. So it's in some ways it's giving the Pharaoh fair chance.
Right.
With two.
Right. But it also adds an anomalous twist to the new threat because it's not predictable. Because now you think, well, I'm going to be warned about this. It's like, no. You lulled into a false sense of security.
But there's another point in what you read, and that is the educational purpose of the plagues. In other words, they're obviously a question of power. And they're obviously a question of judgment, as you were saying about the river of blood. But, you know, that you may know that there's no one like the Lord. And the whole 10 is to show Pharaoh he's not God.
Right. Right.
You know, that comes very
part of the point there, too, is
demonstrative.
Pharaoh's such a tyrant that it takes 10 plagues before he...
To get to him.
Yeah.
It's to show the Israelites, too. Oh, forgive me. It's a very big theme here. And it's written in, I don't like to read into text, it's written in that it will be known that I am God. I have defeated all the gods of Egypt, but it is as much a message to the Israelites as it is to Pharaoh.
Someone help Sarah! Madame Vivienne!
Blackwall's fallen!
It's saying that Pharaoh, not just that Pharaoh is no longer is not God, but also that he's no longer Pharaoh.
All the gods of Egypt, but it is as much a message to the Israelites as it is to Pharaoh.
Yeah, it's saying that Pharaoh, not just that Pharaoh is...
It's dead!
And they're obviously a question of judgment, as you were saying about the river of blood. But, you know, that you may know that there's no one like the Lord. And the whole 10 is to show Pharaoh he's not God.
Right. Right.
You know, that comes very
part
strongly,
of the point there, too, is
demonstrative.
Pharaoh's such a tyrant that it takes 10 plagues before he...
To get to him.
Yeah.
It's to show the Israelites, too. Oh, forgive me. It's a very big theme here. And it's written in, I don't like to read into text, it's written in that it will be known that I am God. I have defeated all the gods of Egypt, but it is as much a message to the Israelites as it is to Pharaoh.
Yeah. Yeah, it's saying that Pharaoh, not just that Pharaoh is not God, but also that he's no longer Pharaoh, that he's no longer king over Egypt, that God has total control over all of the gods of Egypt and everything that gives Egypt life, that makes it tick.
And it's continually emphasizing the principle of reality itself, right? It's that even if you're tyrannical and even if you have all the power there is, if you violate the heavenly order, everything will go to hell.
Yeah. The God of Genesis, that's right. It's the God of Genesis, as it were, re-revealing himself, but in negative terms, as it were. That's having total control over the natural order and transcending it completely.
And Israel, right, that's Jacob's name, right, is Israel, meaning those who struggle with God. What's interesting is it's not a tyrannical rule. Despite the power, you're allowed to struggle. You're allowed, if you're Moses, you're allowed to say,
free will too.
Well, Moses goes back and forth with God a lot, as we've been observing. There's a lot of movement and negotiation with their faith to come to understand God, to come to understand their role, to not want to see the calling. There's room that's built in that isn't evidenced in the Pharaoh.
So that's the qualitative distinction in some sense between servitude in Egypt and the servitude of God in the wilderness. Is that although it's both subordination in some sense to a structure of power, the manner in which the power manifests itself is completely different.
What happens when you negotiate with Pharaoh? He says, no, now get your own straw to make bread.
Right. He just doubles down.
Right. Whereas God's pretty patient with Moses. He's like, all right, we'll give you Aaron. Like, I'll explain. I'll be there.
Right. And he wants, well, the other thing, too, is that God wants voluntary assent.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which is the opposite of the tyrant.
Which is the struggling.
Complete opposite of the tyrant. Yeah.
I love the Jewish notion of argument on behalf of heaven. And it's a great notion. You can argue with the Lord, Abraham at Sodom or Job.
Mm-hmm.
You can argue with the Lord if you're arguing on behalf of his creation. That's a magnificent tradition, I think.
Yes, we learned that early on. That's right. By the way, it's in light, I feel silly commenting on my own comment, but in light of this notion that this will make an impression on Israel as well as on Egypt, I've smitten all their gods and the Pharaoh. One of the great lessons, in my opinion, is that miracles don't work. People think, I know this from decades of talking to people on the radio and in speeches, that if only God did X, Y, or Z. As Woody Allen said, if he just...
Inquisitor.
How were you injured?
A storm blew up a few months back. It's the worst we've seen in a while. I was helping to secure the fishing boat. Einar nearly fell in. I caught him, but the current caught me. My leg got crushed against the rocks. It hasn't set properly.
Here, an offering for your father. From you.
Inquisitor, I can't.
Consider my gift to the Hold a gift to you. Though perhaps don't spread that around.
But the Huntmaster...
Said he'd accept an offering from the hand that gave it.
I don't know what to say.
Say what they want, and you can belong. But maybe when you figure that threatening you was shit, come look for a Jenny.
I'll let you rest.
Lady keep you.
knees, I would believe in him. But it's not true.
No.
Miracles do not produce faith.
No.
It's one of the most important things for every modern person to know. There are many reasons to believe in God, but a miracle won't change your mind. And if, like many of us, you believe that all of life is a miracle, our talking here, the birth of not just of a human child, the birth of an ant, if you don't see that as a miracle, then why will you see split seas as a miracle?
Well, and Moses is obviously capable of seeing a miracle because he turns to look at the burning bush.
That's right. That's right. That's why that was an important part. That's right. Well said. Yes.
And there's knock-on effects both ways, right? I mean, in Moses' case, let's say the incipient moral principle of slaying the Egyptian, even if he's kind of cowardly about it, to having the sensitivity of heart to turn away to see the bush, which then, the burning bushes then leads to the encounter with God, that then leads, so too with Pharaoh, he hardens his heart the first time, he hardens the second time, and I think this happens in our own lives. Like, it's not just the things you've been warned about that your hardness of heart causes you trouble on, but they have knock-on effects too, and so then you do this wrong, and then, oh gosh, then that too, and so I think that it's this third thing of not being warned. It's this sense that you get into the train of this. It's like, no, it's way worse than you think.
Right. You've already set something in motion.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and there's also a gospel story that I can't bring to mind right now, where Christ says there's a servant who's been warned not to misbehave and knows not to, and misbehaves anyways, and there's another servant who does the same thing, but in ignorance, and Christ says to him that because you knew, your punishment is going to be much harsher. And so, you've been warned twice, and you didn't listen, and so now something else is going to happen to you. And that's deserved, because you were, in fact, warned, and you didn't listen. And I saw this in my clinical practice very, very frequently, that, my clients would be ignorant about something and be punished for it, but then when they woke up and realized what they were doing and still did it, the punishment was redoubled. So...
That's like in Catholic absolution, right? In confession, you're not allowed to sin with the notion you can absolve yourself of it later. Mm-hmm. Right? You can't premeditatedly sin and know you have an out.
Right, that's not an escape.
No.
Mm-hmm. In fact, that's worse. Yeah.
So this is jumping out a bit, but there's, I think, a difference between Pharaoh recognizing that he's, the God of the Hebrews is against him, and then wanting to try and remedy that. And then a genuine show of penitence later on. I think it's just before the killing of the firstborn, where he actually repents. He says he expresses sorrow, and it's almost as if that 10th plague, which is just probably the most horrific of them all, is a sort of is such a serious punishment because his sorrow, his awareness, his conscience is really awakened at that point. I mean, it's beginning to be here, but it's still quite instrumental. He realizes something's wrong. And he knows that he can fix it.
I'm told our hunt master to offering Finn Coldenson. Nothing more's been said. I will only thank you for paying hospitality to an invalid. I must complete the preparations. A strange turn of events may not make Colden's journey any easier.
By the way, you've made me
The gods
rethink
measure
this.
both outcome and the actions,
I just wanted you
or
to know
deceptions, behind it.
he had a lot of profound things to say.
Oh, yeah. He's something.
I assume he has such a bad name because the Nazis liked him. I mean, why does he have such a bad name?
His sister warped a lot of his writing, and then there were derivatives of it that were used by the Nazis to justify their actions. But Nietzsche's philosophy is he had an absolute horror of absolutist states, and that's crystal clear. And so,
and the consequences of the death of God.
Oh yes, and there's no one more prophetic about that except maybe Dostoevsky.
And he always spoke very highly of you, Dennis.
Thank you. I didn't want to say.
And they did.
Before you go and pick up Dennis's point, I agree with you totally. And Jesus makes roughly the same point. When in the parable someone says, send someone down to my relatives, and he says, no, even if they see the resurrection from the dead, they won't believe.
Right.
You're absolutely
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're accurate.
Yeah.
What you have here, you have words. And there's a lot of words. The words are vital, but not enough. And then you have these power wonders, and the two together they're not enough. Eventually, it has to be the 10th one that does it. But I wanted to raise the question for all of us at the end, maybe. What are the lessons for this? For our confronting what's today a system and a spirit that is all embracing. So often we're just words. And clearly words alone for Moses, not enough.
Well, and there's a negative miracle aspect here too. It might be that people are less convinced about positive miracles, but if something negative enough happens to you, you know, that's outside your realm of expectation, sometimes that can actually wake you up.
Just
Death, or a catastrophe in your life.
I see. Oh, that's it. But do people see that as a miracle, though?
Well, that's a good question. You know, we tend to think of a miracle as only something positive, but these plagues are obviously miracles.
That's right. I like that. That's fascinating.
And it's a lot more difficult to deny a negative miracle. Yeah.
I've never thought of that. Am I happy?
Greetings, stranger. Why do they dress like that?
The new Thatcher is good. Finn Collinson's a good lad. His father was always proud of him. Still would be.
Farewell.
Farewell.
It came.
Yeah, there's nothing happier than a negative miracle, man.
I always think about Solzhenitsyn in that regard, of like where he was to have his epiphany, right? He was like the least empowered human being. I mean, he had testicular cancer in a gulag. Like there was, you can't. Yeah, I mean, and that's where he had an awakening.
Frankel too.
Mandela, right?
I think the negative miracle problem, you've really transfixed me here, it leads to a different issue for me. God's existence to me is so rationally compelling that I don't even understand atheism. But I think God's goodness is a leap of faith, not God's existence.
Right. But I think it's the leap of faith, because in some sense what you do is you decide that things are good and you're going to act in the service of the good in many ways despite the evidence.
Yes.
Right. So that's why it's an act of faith. It's like, well, yeah, you know, you can understand arguments for nihilism and despair, especially if you meet people who've been brutalized beyond belief. But then now and then you meet someone who's been brutalized beyond belief, and instead of being corrupt and nihilistic, they've pulled out of that a goodness that's so deep that it's miraculous. And you meet people like that pretty damn often. And they decided, and really they've decided, despite all this, sometimes that's so brutal you can't even listen to it. Despite all this, I do believe that things are good, and I will serve the good, and that's faith.
Yes, but they're not. In those cases, they're rarely doing so without their own evidence. I mean, they're precisely the people who are able to illuminate to you, you know, the abiding underlying goodness, because they're actually connected with it. It's not.
Yeah,
not doing this in a vacuum.
People usually, it's maybe associated with the burning bush idea. I mean, I'm thinking of an artist that I've worked with for a long time who was brutalized beyond belief when he was young. And he found his salvation through beauty. And so it was like the burning bush. He noticed that despite how catastrophic his life had been and how tyrannized he was in the most fundamental sense, beauty beckoned to him, and he heeded the call. And it completely transformed his life and his character, his career, everything.
Right, so it's not as if it's simply against the evidence. I mean, there is...
Right. But he was, yeah, that's so interesting, too, because he was still, despite all that, he was still open to the possibility that there might be something beyond the catastrophe, right?
But isn't part of the answer we were saying yesterday in the nature of God? You don't come to discover him abstractly. He's, I will be who I will be. In my actions, delivering you, caring for you, you come to know he's good. There is evidence, as Stephen is saying. Sure, isn't that the answer, Dennis, to what you're saying? We don't say he's good because it's theology principle number 15 or whatever. Because we've seen the goodness of God in his actions in history or in our own individual lives or whatever.
Well, it would seem to be a hard argument to make to a concentration camp survivor that predominantly the goodness need to make sense, that the percentage of Jews who went through the death camps, and I specifically mentioned death camps, who came out, the proportions of atheists and believers was the same. Many switched. Atheists became believers and believers became atheists, but the proportion remained virtually identical. So there were people who have only good in their life, relatively speaking, who don't believe in God. So I'm challenging my own question, because I wrestled with this, because I think the hardest law in the 613 laws of the Torah is to love God with all your heart and all your soul. I long believe that's the hardest. I have no problem trying to obey God.
Throw yourself into existence fully as if it's good.
So we have a look around.
That's right.
Look at it.
That's
pretty
right.
rough.
That's right. That's right.
So Solzhenitsyn was struck in concentration